So we'd like to thank our panel that just presented as they helped us in the move to establish policy for Black America. And we are excited now to move toward the next panel, which is the panel that is going to talk to us about redeeming the soul of Black America through prophetic preaching. It is my honor to introduce the narrator for this, the moderator for this panel, the Reverend Reginald Sharp, who is the illustrious and prolific pastor of the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago, Illinois. Reverend Sharp.
How are you?
Take it away.
Thank you, Reverend Lane. We love you. We appreciate you so much. We are looking forward to a great time today. Am I supposed to introduce our panelists now? I believe so. Well, the Reverend Dr. Dominique Robinson. She is the Dean of Wiley College, and have the Reverend Dr. Gina Stewart. She serves at Christ Missionary Baptist Church there in Memphis, Tennessee, and is just a preacher's preacher. We have Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III. He is the pastor there in Dallas at the Friendship West Church. And we have Bishop Ingram, who serves the illustrious First District of the A.M.E. Church. How are you, Bishop? Good to see you.
All right. Good to see you, Dr.
Yes. I think Dr. Haynes is coming in. Is he coming in? Okay. Well, they're going to add him in a minute momentarily, hopefully. But I'm looking forward to this discussion today. Reverend Dr. Robinson, you okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Dr. Gina, you're well?
I am fine. How are you?
I'm wonderful today. Well, let's go ahead and jump into this conversation. What a topic during this period, redeeming the soul of Black America through prophetic preaching. I think it's important for us to first begin. Well, let me pause and say thank you to the vision of Greater Allen Cathedral, Reverend Elaine, Reverend Floyd Flake, and Reverend Stephen Green for this vision, being our founder, to stand on this platform. So shout out to everybody that's working behind the scenes to make this happen. So what is prophetic preaching? This is just a conversation. You already know how we converse. So just because those others are listening in doesn't mean that one person has to speak. But I want us to jump in just to get us started. Stuart, would you just want to begin the conversation? What is prophetic preaching, and how do we explain this to people about what this is?
Okay, thank you, Reverend Nephew Reggie Sharp. It's good to see you, and it's good to see Bishop Ingram and Reverend Dr. Dominique, and of course, we're looking forward to seeing Pastor Haynes in just a few minutes. And we're thankful to the Flakes and to Reverend Green for convening us. When I think about prophetic preaching, I think about it as an act of resistance, a resistance to the narratives, the ideologies and negative consequences, like white supremacy, alt-rightism, nationalism, and those other ideologies that are in direct contradiction to God's will and God's intention for our lives. And it is a way of us challenging those ideologies with a word from the other side that lets us know that the present truth that we're experiencing, whether it's in terms of negative narratives or negative real world consequences, are not the last word for our lives.
Pastor Sharp, you're muted.
Can't hear you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for that, Dr. Stewart, Reverend Dr. Auntie. What is prophetic preaching? Anybody else want to jump in? Bishop Ingram, you are muted now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, now you're free. You're free now. Happy
I think one dynamic and aspect about prophetic preaching is that it moves us out of the periphery to the very center and core of those things and issues that impact the human spirit. It is a preaching that really challenges us to move beyond the status quo, to confront those systems that otherwise oppress, repress, depress, and infatuate and impact our people. It is a preaching that says that in a biblical context, where we want justice to roll down as waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. It is a preaching that enables and empowers preachers to move out of their comfort zone, to preach with a sense of assurance that we're not preaching just ourselves, we're preaching Christ and Him crucified. And again, to take the risk, to know that we're not called to be popular, but we're called to really speak to those issues that God would have us to speak, to challenge and speak truth to power.
That's good. Thank you, Bishop. Dean?
Well, we all know that preaching is both theological and rhetorical. And so I would argue that prophetic preaching is a rhetorical device, a construct that helps us to combat the social ills of society. And it invites individuals into a space to assess our social cultural context through the lens of a sacred text called the Bible. And it allows that our experience as Black people to be authoritative, to be able to say from this experience is how we see God, experience God, and articulate God. So I think that prophetic preaching is communal and dialogical and allows us to just bring in all of who we are, our color, our ethnicity, our experience, to be able to find God in that. It lives in a space of liminality, that a space of not yet, still to come, and still speaks to exactly what's happening. So it's hope.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that word hope, because when I think about prophetic preaching, a lot of times you hear people critiquing, you hear this passionate, righteous indignation behind the preaching, and we're calling out presidents and we're calling out systems. But there's another side to prophetic preaching that often doesn't get discussed, and that is that we're charged with painting what the world should look like. And then so it's this balance between isness and oughtness. And so what we know what is, so while we do call that out, we also have the task of painting this oughtness. What does the world look like? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So speak to us about that side of prophetic preaching that I don't hear a lot about often, and that is painting pictures for people, imagery for people out of the Bible of what the world should be. How do we do that? How do we do that work?
I think one of the things that one of the tasks that we have when we talk about painting an alternative picture or an alternative future begins with doing an assessment of the world as it is. And we know that when we look at the world as it is, we know that there are systems and structures in place that undermine God's intentions for human flourishing. And when we look at those disparities or those realities that impact and impede our lives, one of the things that thinking people and people who have a commitment to the biblical text have to say is something is wrong with this picture. There is something wrong with this picture, and we know that it is out of alignment with God's will. And so we ask then, not only do we do a critique and analysis, but I think it challenges us to start dreaming about what is the appropriate response. What is the appropriate response for our communities, for our congregations, for our denominations, and how does this preaching shift our focus from the congregation to what's happening to us as individuals and the local church to what is happening in the world, and in what ways can we intervene in the world in that way? And so we not only paint a picture of what's possible, but I think we also invite people to envision, I guess you could say, emancipatory practice, to trace out liberating strategies about the way that we can live our lives in response to this gospel. It's said that that's how Fannie Lou Hamer decided to get involved in voting, in the voters registration. She heard a sermon and it changed her life. And as a result, that was prophetic preaching.
Yes, absolutely.
Let me get another.
And we have to pause for the cause, because the OG just came, the Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III. He is the esteemed, illustrious pastor of Friendship West there in Dallas, Texas. Dr. Haynes, how are you today, sir?
Man, I'm being blown away by all of this prophetic brilliance. I'm taking notes. I've been backstage learning how to do this thing because evidently I ain't been doing it right.
We
Well,
know better than that.
Yeah, tell us
right.
anything, right?
Listen, I grew up listening to you do prophetic preaching. So, you have laid groundwork for a whole generation. So we appreciate your work. And thank you for joining this conversation. Dr. Stewart just dropped a major nugget. She talked about us participating in the work of drawing a picture of emancipatory practices. We're going to let you jump in right there, Dr. Haynes. We're talking about prophetic preaching. How do we paint this picture of what the world ought to be in spite of
Right.
what the world is right now? What do you want to say?
Right, right. And I'll just piggyback on what has already been said. And for me, prophetic preaching raises consciousness. That's why I love the term about stay woke. I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s last sermon on a Sunday was entitled Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. So he was staying woke and preaching wokeness by way of prophetic preaching, even in his last sermon, Sunday sermon, I should say. And so for me, prophetic preaching raises consciousness that denounces things as they are while envisioning what ought to be, and then energizing us with strategies to move from the what ugly isness to God's intended altness. And so for me, prophetic preaching has to begin, as you all talked about earlier, with what is. I never will forget a conversation I overheard through YouTube between Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin, and they were looking at what was going on in Birmingham in 1963. 5 police officers had their feet, don't miss this, on the neck of one black woman in Birmingham during the Birmingham campaign. And Nikki Giovanni raised this question to James Baldwin: what kind of country could produce the kind of police officers that saw it as their responsibility to put their feet on the neck of one black woman? And so amazingly enough, she's talking about 1963, and yet 1963 still shows up what in 2020 in this country. And so what kind of country is producing the kinds of police officers that can use a no warrant break-in to Breonna Taylor and snuff her life out? What kind of country are we in? Jesse Jackson talks about prophetic preaching is not just preaching about the sin within, but the sin we are in. We are in a country that produces the sin of oppression, the sin of injustice, toxic masculinity, sexism, call the roll. That's the sin we are in. And yet prophetic preaching at the same time says, I can't stop there. I'm going to denounce. I'm going to put a spotlight on the sin we are in. But at the same time, I have an eschatological hope that's going to break through the sin that we are in. And my prophetic preaching is so prophetic, I'm going to give you strategies to get that will energize you so we get from where we are to where we ought to be. So prophetic preaching also provides that bridge. I love that bridge that gets us from this ugly isness that produces a country that could do Rashard like that could do George Floyd like that could do our sister Breonna Taylor like that. But it produces that bridge to get us to God's kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah.
I think one of the things also, and the way in which Dr. Haynes kind of fuses together, using part of what your expression is about the isness and the all. The fact of the matter is that no preaching is relevant preaching unless it provides not only the eschatological hope, but gives a kind of sneak preview of the way things ought to be. That, in other words, when you're preaching, it ought to at least lift up 4 dynamics. First, it ought to engage the minds, because we can't be having people come to church and ask them to leave their minds in the vestibule. No, you got to get people to think. Secondly, it has to be a preaching that energizes the will. In other words, when we come together, what is our real intention? That once we leave here, It's not just having a good time in church, having people jump up. I ain't interested in how high you jump. I want to know what you're going to do when you come down.
Come on.
Third thing is about disturbing the consciousness. That we still got to speak truth to power and let folk know that this is not a point where we're dealing with powerlessness, but God has given us power. He's not giving us a spirit of fear, but a power of love and sound mind. And then ultimately, stirring our hearts, because preaching would be void if it didn't inspire people to do something. Fact of the matter is that the overarching piece about Black preaching, period, is to provide that eschatological hope as the things ought to be, not the way they are.
Right.
But we have to constantly envision a world in which we are saying that this is the way it ought to be, not just reserved for a particular person or pedigree or anybody else. This is all of our world. And so we got to challenge folk to make a kind of community in the world in which we want it to be.
Absolutely. Bishop, listen, y'all talking mighty heavy on this line today. I want to ask this. There are people who say that the Bible, Christianity has no place for social justice. We've heard this from the John MacArthurs of the world. We've heard this from the right conservative voices from the church. I even heard an Australian white pastor say recently, because I'm not Black, I don't feel the need to preach about Black Lives Matter or the race issues going on in America. And I responded to myself. I said, well, congratulations on being privileged enough that you don't have to respond. But what do you all say? Because it's not just white pastors. There are Black pastors who fundamentally believe that there is no place for this social justice thread that shows up in our preaching. So twofold, and anybody can jump in. I really want to hear from Dr. Robinson and Dean, Dr. Stewart on this one particularly. What do you say to those who say, I don't see social justice in the Bible. I don't know why we need to do this. What is your response to that? Anybody?
Go ahead, Doc.
I guess I would first say, one, we thinking about the gospel itself. I am unable to separate social justice from being a believer of Jesus Christ. I don't know how one can preach or follow a man of color who had a government-sanctioned death, execution, and separate having to deal with race issues and race matters. If we're talking about radical love and hospitality, then those values of Jesus Christ include everyone and every single body. And we see that even in the narrative of the last liturgical holiday we just celebrated, that of Pentecost. People of every ethnicity, of different languages were gathered in one space. And it was the move of the Holy Spirit that allowed them to move from out of that space and move into a place of community in a way that we need to do. And so for those who don't see social justice as a part of preaching the gospel or a part of following the way, I'm not sure then if you should call yourself a believer, because I'm not sure that is the way in which we follow the word and the will. And again, if we're talking about prophetic preaching, it's about the role of imagination. And Black people have always had an amazing imagination. We've had to be able to see things outside of our circumstances. And so the role of imagination to the development of faith, which moves to our articulation of hope, is significant to that of prophetic preaching. And again, it's about being able to identify with the community. Again, our prophetic preaching, what each and every one of us do on this, we identify with our community. There's nothing we preach about that we haven't experienced for ourselves. And so being able to identify with the community, being able to articulate, so offering that hope comes from us. We have to convince ourselves of that hope before we can convince anybody else of it. And so being able to separate race from social justice I'm just not sure you're a believer, is what I would say to that person.
Wow.
I would add that, when we read the scriptures, we discover that that justice is a central theme throughout the scripture, and that God's passion for justice is a central theme throughout the scriptures. And we also have to acknowledge that the scriptures are countercultural, and they call us as people of God to a reorientation of our worldview and our consciousness to see the world the way God sees it. And if we're going to see the world the way God sees it, it means that we must at some point adopt or use a justice lens, because this is part of the centrality of the biblical story and the biblical writ. And these texts reveal to us, when we read them and we look at the world as it is and then think about the world as it ought to be, that there are systems and structures and institutions that are corrupt, and that throughout proclamation, we help to bring about transformation. So I would argue that if we are doing ourselves and the people that we preach to a disservice if we don't proclaim justice. We have not really preached the full counsel of God if we don't proclaim justice, because God is a God of justice. And the scriptures have this central theme of justice interwoven throughout the scriptures. Even when Jesus went into the synagogue and preached his first sermon, he was preaching prophetically that day, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good news to the, the recovery. It almost got him thrown over a cliff, but what angered them was that he was taking a text from Isaiah 61, but he added the year of favor. Really ticked the folk off. So,
come on now.
Talk about it. Talk about it. Talk about it.
And so, when we look at the ministry of Jesus and we look at the witness of the scriptures, we see that there's a vision, as Freddie has already said, that has been, and Bishop Ingram has already said before, a vision of an eschatological reality, a reality that is yet to come, but that God is creating in our midst. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Yes. That's good. That's good. Dr. Haynes, you look like
add this right quick. Yeah, man, because the pulpit royalty that just preceded us, they let me know this, and that is, too many times our white colleagues and those who are preaching a white gospel in blackface, what they've done is preach basically from an edited and extracted Bible. There's a Bible, ironically, at the Smithsonian right now. It's called a slave Bible, because missionaries, in quotes, from England, when they were trying to save black enslaved persons in the Caribbean, they extracted from that Bible anything having to do with justice and liberation. It's an extracted, edited Bible. And that is what is going on with many of our colleagues. They preach from an extracted, edited Bible. They have a hermeneutic that is top down and not bottom up. I often quote the great Dr. Jerome Ross, brilliant black biblical scholar. Ross puts it like this: all of scripture occurred in one of 6 contexts of oppression: Egyptian oppression, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Grecian, Roman. And so if the biblical text is in a context of oppression, you cannot preach a text out of context lest it becomes a pretext that cons your people. And so a lot of people have been conned because they're listening to an edited Bible that never addresses the context. Jesus, thank you, Dean, because Dean said, here is Jesus, born homeless, grows up in the hood in Nazareth. He's straight out of Nazareth. That would be his album if he was doing an album, Straight Out of Nazareth. Straight out of Nazareth, he ministers on the margins to those who are marginalized. And when he comes to Jerusalem, what does he do? He leads a march on Jerusalem, not a Palm Sunday processional. That's watering it down. He leads a march, a demonstration, and then goes into the seat of religious, political, and economic power and says, I'm going to turn this mother out, turns over the table. Because what Jesus is saying is that Jesus is saying, I am from the margins. I'm coming to the center on behalf of those on the margins to disrupt what is in the center. And then he got lynched on a cross. He got lynched. Brother got lynched. That dark-skinned Palestinian Jew got lynched on a cross, and only the Roman Empire could hand down that kind of sentence. So when he gets up on Sunday, this adds to our resurrection gospel, and that is the resurrection is an insurrection against injustice, because the stone got rolled away. That stone that was sealed by Rome, it was rolled away, not so he could get out. He was already up and out, but so that we could get in and see that the resurrection is redemptive resistance and rebellion against repression. Matter of fact, if you break down, Dominique and I, we're in the same Greek class right now, break down the word resurrection in Greek, and at its root is rebellion. You don't have resurrection without rebellion.
Yes.
Yes,
And
sir.
revolt.
And the peace. You know, one
Say
of the
it,
other
Dr. Stewart.
I just said and revolt. Rebellion and revolt.
and one of the
Rebellion
things we have
and
to refuse to do is allow ourselves to be caught up and entrapped in white folks' mess. Part of
Right.
the issue that what you're saying is when you mention that these white counterparts and some other folk refuse to preach a social gospel, it is only because in many instances they want us to preach an accommodating gospel
Right.
that will not challenge the status quo. Ask yourself, why did the social gospel come into being in the first place? When Rossenbach and everybody else was dealing with these issues, they recognized that there was an inequity, there was a sense of insensitivity, there was a sense of not realizing that in the context of using Howard Thurman's piece about Jesus and the disinherited and dispossessed, obviously there was some things happening and it's still going on.
yes, sir.
When you look at some of the writings of the earlier persons who were talking about this ethos, and I use the word about Dean, look at the hermeneutic of the word, not just what did it say, but what does it say? It says that there has to be a resistance going against those things that impact the lives of people. Otherwise, there will be no need. And so when you start dealing with Christian apologetics and people saying, no, it doesn't say that, according to who? The question is, every man and woman writes or paints out of his own ethos. Now, if things were going well, and if it was a melting pot, which it's not, people are trying to say about cultural pluralism that all of us is just one great melting pot and all of us the same. Now, you know that's a lie. The fact of the matter is, if things were not well, we wouldn't have to say anything. But we
That's right.
do have to say something. And those are the issues.
You know, this is interesting because we have issues that are outside of the walls of our church. Well, not really outside, but they affect Black people differently. So racism, but then you can go down the list: sexism, xenophobia. We have issues right in our own church where there's oppression within the walls of our church. Certain ministries still don't allow or approve of women in ministry. We're still debating. We say Black Lives Matter until we get to the subject of gay lives and LGBTQIA lives. And so there are moments, and you said something, I think, Dr. Stewart, Jesus' preaching got him run out of the temple almost over a cliff.
Almost.
So truthfully here, prophetic preaching is dangerous.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's dangerous against the systems of oppression outside of the church, but it's also dangerous to say some things within the church. So what are some of the topics that the church, and when I say the church, capital C, what are we trying to tiptoe around that are going to be some of the key issues we need prophetic preaching to address to make sure all of our people are well, that really we try to stay away from because we're not ready to be run out the church yet? Let's go there.
Well, prophetic preaching holds the community accountable too. So when we talk about prophetic preaching, we're not just talking about our white counterparts. We're holding our members of our congregations accountable as well. Right. And so we, that helps us. Again, we're inviting everybody to assess their social cultural content through this lens of, the Bible, but it's holding every single one of us accountable, and nobody's living a perfect life. And so that prophetic preaching it mandates us to talk about the things we wouldn't talk about in the church, the taboo subjects of sex and sexuality and embodiment, and hypersexualization, and sexuality. It pushes us to have to address it, to actually not just address it, but be very clear. What is your theological conviction on this? And how will you articulate that? And how are you leading people? Because preaching has become it highlights the theology and the values of the African-American community. That's why preaching has become such an apex of our worship experience. And so we have to be very careful as preachers behind sacred desks, articulating what we're saying God is saying about a particular subject and issue. We've worked through so many times of having an inherited faith that sometimes we just say or preach what we've heard before. But when we sit down and have to push ourselves to ask ourselves the question, what do we believe about same gender marriages and about rights for those who are marrying each other? What do we believe at one point? What do we believe about HIV and AIDS and the epidemic? We will allow colorism, elitism, and classism to kill us as Black people before racism kills us if we don't stop it and address it through our prophetic preaching lens.
Mm.
We're
My.
Say that.
Here we are.
I would add to what the dean has so eloquently said, that, you know, in a lot of ways, preaching is often hijacked by a number of agendas. And a number of those agendas are often unjust. They do not lead to human flourishing. And we need preaching that's going to speak truth to those powerful forces whose alternative facts don't want to be challenged. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we still see sexism, and we see racism, and we see homophobia and other issues still deeply embedded, not only in society, but also in our churches. And so, as she has already said, we have to get our own theology right. And then we get our own theology right, and think about what God's intention is for the world. We have to be bold enough, and we have to be willing to take the risk. I think that prophetic preaching, Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert says that in his book, Exodus Preaching, is that prophetic preaching is preaching that dares to take a risk. And there's always a risk involved when we decide to challenge the status quo, when we decide to challenge those alternative facts that don't want to be challenged. As we've already talked about, people saying that there's no such thing as social justice, etc. It is to take a risk and lift up those issues when we stand behind the sacred desk. And it's never without risk, or without opposition, or without losing members, or without making somebody mad, because that is the nature of the gospel.
Yeah. And so I'll just add to that prophetic preaching then causes us, if we're honest, and I love the dean's insight on this, to interrogate our own privilege, because I bring to my hermeneutical exercise a presupposition that is rooted in a privilege, as a male, even as a black male in this Eurocentric world in which we live. But there's a privilege I bring. I've got to interrogate that privilege, because if I don't interrogate that privilege, I'll engage in otherization. And when I otherize other people who may not have my privilege, then I am guilty of saying justice is only for a select few. And if justice ain't for all, you ain't got justice at all. If freedom ain't for all, you don't have freedom at all. And so I've got to interrogate Freddie Haynes. Look at the privileges you have. Are you allowing those privileges to inform your presuppositions as you begin to exegete the text? Why? Because if you do, you are guilty of the same thing that white preachers are doing, who are in bed with the empire. And as they are in bed with the empire, they give birth to an illicit gospel. And their illicit gospel is always top down and never bottom up. And so first, I got to interrogate my privilege to make sure my privilege doesn't get in the way of the prophetic that God wants to utter through me. And once that is done, then watch this. I can bring in and take the dangerous step. Thank you, Reg. The dangerous step of including those who have been otherized. And the otherized, again, we know what it's like to be otherized. And I love that Dr. Stewart brought in Jesus's first sermon, because he exegetes it by saying, okay, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And then he sets him up to get thrown over the cliff by using illustrations of the othered. He uses the illustrations of what? The woman who found herself. She was not a part of the community of faith, quote unquote, but that woman that Elijah ministered to, she was otherized, and yet Jesus includes the othered. As a matter of fact, she's a woman. She's not just a woman, but she's a woman who is excluded from the community. And so what Jesus models for us is that real prophetic preaching is able to come down off of the perch of privilege, get with the othered, and bring the othered inside.
I want to add, when you asked about some of the subject matters, I want to add that we also don't always talk about those who are differently or disabled. So those are subject matters that we have to address. Yes, and again, like Dr. Haynes mentioned, the privilege. We do so much work of dividing ourselves. If you went to a PWI, HBCU, if you're in a mainline historical denomination or an independent, we do so much. We have to work on those lines of division that we've created. Who can sit on the front pew, the politics of the church, who's in power, and again, that hierarchy that Dr. Haynes brings up, that bottom up from the top down. So I think those are some of the issues that need to be addressed in prophetic preaching. And I think that we also have to say, let's give each other space to evolve. Maybe you weren't on one end of the spectrum 5 years ago when you were assessing it, and like you said, interrogating your own theological convictions. As you grow, evolve, learn, and change, give people space to grow and evolve and allow their prophetic preaching to grow with them. And so I think that sometimes we can't allow what we've declared from the sacred desk to be that only space we live in, and give space to evolve. So people need to understand that prophetic preaching grows with us.
Yeah.
Listen,
I think one of the things that is also what Dr. Haynes was referring to. One of the things we really have to do is be realistic and honest with ourselves. We can't preach a myopic gospel. We have to preach a gospel of one. We look at ourselves. I mean, the fact of the matter is that many of us are born originals. We sometimes die chief substitutes. The fact of the matter is that when you start dealing with being able, you can't address certain things until you address the things about yourself. You asked a question about even in the church. Sometimes folk really don't want, there's an old phrase that says, tell me a lie even though I want to hear the truth. Fact of the matter is, when you start telling folk some truth, it makes you dangerous and you take the risk. Because many people now, and when you start talking about prophetic preaching as opposed to somebody just preaching, is that we are interested sometimes in tickling the fancies, trying to be popular, and celebrity and Christian don't go together. So if you're going to preach a real gospel, you got to preach a gospel that speaks to those issues that impact the lives of people. But also it says this, that you got to be willing to be free enough to know that your calling comes from God, not from people. And when you start dealing with that, sometimes we don't want to be on the cutting edge. But many people, like Fred Haynes, he's not just the cutting edge, he's the knife, because he speaks to issues that cut across those issues that impact the lives of people. So I think that, Carl Menninger one time said, whatever became of sin. Well, sometimes folk ain't preaching about sin no more, because what we're preaching is about a gospel that sometimes is watered down. And it's a gospel that sometimes folk tell me what I want to hear, not what I need to hear. And when you start talking about this issue about social justice, many folk are not free enough to preach that because they're worried about their stability. They're worried about whether or not it's going to keep them in a situation. But, I just believe that if God has called you, he will make provisions for you.
Yes.
Even when some folk try to deny you, God will still bless you.
Come on now.
Listen, you preaching and talking right, Bishop. One of my heroes of all time is Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright.
Right.
And so we know, we witness close up what it looks like for a prophetic preacher to, almost lose it all. And some of his own people turn against him. And so when we really talk about prophetic preaching is dangerous, it's not dangerous just because of the rhetoric or the presentation. It's dangerous because of the momentum that's created after it happens. And really what's dangerous is prophetic pastoring, when the whole ministry becomes prophetic. Because there's a difference in being prophetic in your speech versus being prophetic in your action. The praxis and the theory has to line up. Orthodoxy is the doctrine, orthopraxy is the practice. And so that's what we're moving to. That's the goal, to move to that orthopraxy, where it's not just a sermon, it's a movement. It's a ministry that begins. But we all have to prepare for the consequences. You might, districts, if you're in certain denominations, what happens when the bishop doesn't approve? What happens when the church or the deacon's board or the mother's board says, no, too far, Reb? How do we prepare preachers to deal with the aftermath of prophetic preaching and ministry where there are consequences? What do we say to that? Does anybody want to jump in?
I think that's a work of identity, knowing who you are, what you believe, and what you're willing to put up for risk of it. And I think that's actually a part of the reason why I make sure I navigate between the church and the academy, so that should one decide they don't like what I have to say, I should be able to have some stability with the other one. But it's literally the walk that I have to do because of the living out the life of prophetic ministry, right? And I think that part of our role in doing this prophetic work is to make sure that as we prepare for it and we're preaching to people and asking them to take on that prophetic praxis, that we also let them know of the risk factors involved as well. Because we want to kind of get to a place where people aren't depending on us to be able to hear from God. We are equipping the people to be able to hear from God. We, through prophetic preaching, are decentralizing the fact that you have to only go to the preacher to be able to hear the word of God and understand what prophetic ministry is. And so I think that it's about identity, being very clear about who God has called you to be, being very clear about your theological convictions, and evolving in that. And so I think that's essential to our work of prophetic witness. Who am I? Who has God called me to be? And being clear that I can't do everything. So your prophetic witness does not have to encompass every ism. Choose what you are most passionate about and do your work in that lane, and respect another person's work, and realize that you all can complement each other and you're not in competition with each other.
Right.
Yeah, and I would add too that you have to, that, well, speaking from where I sit, I think it's been important to also educate people for liberation. And that where we're trying to take people, we have to help them, educate them about that. A lot of what we are talking about, or when we talk about prophetic preaching, it's not something that many people have often heard. And so I think that it's important that as we try to move toward change, we also have to teach the change. And as we discern our own prophetic identity, we help people, or those that we preach to and teach to discern and discover theirs as well. And it becomes a really a wonderful journey, because you can begin to see people catching or becoming ignited about prophetic witness, not just the preaching, but also prophetic witness, and realizing that theology does have a public dimension, and that it is how we not only interact when we're in the sanctuary, but what does faith look like when we interact in the world and we move out into the public square.
Right.
And you got to trust God. At the end of the day, you just got to trust God. Trust that God, Bishop said, you got to trust that God is going to take care of you.
Yeah, you got to know that God's got your back. I love that. We did something that didn't even come from me, and that's why I love what the dean was saying about how it has to move from being minister centric to ministry movement, because if it's just centered around the personality of the preacher, the pastor, then of course you're going to run into trouble. But when you have a movement that you have, help to raise up through discipleship, through understanding that our prophetic orthopraxy, thank you, Reg, our prophetic orthopraxy is what we do as a result of who we are, then you're ready to take on all comers. We got something we just did. We hung this banner on this freeway side of our church that says Black Lives Matter. That didn't even come from me. That came from my daughter. It came from my daughter. A.M.E said, "Daddy, why don't we hang a Black Lives Matter?" And before I knew it, they did it without the pastor saying anything. That's right. And so now, of course, you have those who are coming for us. Someone hit me up saying, "Well, I'm gonna sue you for putting that sign up." I mean, because they will come for you. But here's the thing. They ain't just coming for me. They coming for the movement now. So you got to come for the movement, but you also got to come from my maker, because since I have a movement and a maker who has my back, it's like, come with it. I didn't send for you, but since you coming for me, then come on, let's go, because I prophetically, you don't want this smoke.
Dr. Shaw, can I tell you this one? Now,
come on, Bishop.
Let me go back even with Dr. Haynes and with Dr. Stewart. You mentioned about Jeremiah, Dr. Wright, right?
Yes, sir.
You know, I pastored in Chicago one time, the oldest black church.
Yes, sir.
Now Jeremiah had a sign in front of his church about free South Africa.
Right.
Long before it became popular with a whole lot of folk, right?
Right.
Then years later, I'm using it. And when I went to Detroit to my last church that I pastored, I put that sign out in the beautiful manicured lawn, and it was in a particular area where the folk were trying to be semi-bourgeois, most of them were just one paycheck from being broke themselves. But the fact of the matter is, I had some folk to come up to challenge me on that side.
Right.
Until
I
they
know.
came to a realization that all of us, quote unquote, are in this together. And so we had to desensitize folk to really understand that this was not just an organization, it was a movement. And in the words of Victor Hugo, an idea whose time has come. And so we subsequently changed the whole ethos and the whole attitude about it. And the fact of the matter is, Dr. Haynes, for all of us, we have to constantly put up, and you talked about the art form of preaching.
Yeah.
We have to let our folks see that we, as people who are oppressed, cannot afford to allow ourselves the luxury to think that we made it, because we're not there yet. My daughter used a phrase about when you're traveling, she said, "Are we there yet?" No, we're not there yet. We still got a long way to go. And when you start putting it in the context of Martin Luther King's book, what, in 1967, that where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Well, this is all of the revelations about it, because we still in chaos trying to create a community. And that's why prophetic preaching must continue on, because we are not there yet.
Right.
Absolutely.
Rich, can I say this right quick? Because prophetic preaching, again, has its eyes on the future, that eschatological hope breaking in on our existential now. And here's the thing that always happens. Prophetic preachers rarely are appreciated in the now.
Right.
Come on.
It's in the not yet that people come to say, oh, right was right.
Right.
Because here we are now in 2020, and Jeremiah Wright Jr. is more and more applauded and appreciated today, because we had to catch up to what he had seen way back then. And so really one of the beautiful things about doing this dangerous preaching, let's bring Frank Thomas in here. The thing about doing this dangerous preaching is that danger says, okay, I've got to disrupt the right now, because I see the not yet breaking in. Other folk can't see the not yet breaking in. And since they can't see it, I've got to articulate it, catch the hell that comes with it in the meantime. But the good news is, sooner or later, by and by, you're going to say, they was right. Malcolm was right. Martin was right. Jeremiah was right. They're going to say that, but they have to catch up to it. And that's the thing I think we have to learn to live in, that prophetic tension. And that is, people sometimes don't catch up to your message until you may be gone.
That's what makes it prophetic
Bishop
preaching, because some people are just preaching. And the difference between the preacher and the prophet is that one looks through a microscope, the other one looks through a telescope. Fact of the matter is, you got to be able to see further down the line and see where it's coming.
Come on, Bishop. Listen, y'all.
And listen, Bishop Yvette Flanders said the only difference between a prophet and a heretic is time.
Yes, that's it. That's it. I was trying to figure out who said, Doctor. I appreciate you for saying that. Listen, we got 5 minutes left, and everybody knows that we can continue talking about this for the rest of the day and not get tired, because every person on this panel, you have a passion. The late William Sloane Coffin has a book called The Passion for the Possible. Everybody on here has a passion for what's possible, and I honor that. So here's what I want to do. Reverend Stephen Green had a vision to make sure that every panel focuses us on what we need to do, not what we just need to preach. What are the areas what are the active areas? What is the homework and the heart work that we need pastors listening to on this line, and church members and Christians and believers and activists that are out listening to us right now? Where do we need to put our energy as we work towards freedom? And you don't have to be right. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just say whatever comes to your mind that you want us to hear.
Who wants to go first? I'll say something. I want to borrow. 3 minutes. Okay, I'll try to say it quick. I think about something that Reggie Williams and Danielle Ayers said in their book, To Serve the Present Age, and I think it's appropriate for what we're talking about. They said that you can either be a thermostat or a thermometer. A thermometer measures and registers what's going on around it, but a thermostat changes and adjusts the temperature. thermometer, and we really have to kind of do both in this season, because we know that thermostats adjust. If we're going to change the atmosphere around us, we got to adjust structures and institutions. But we also know that while we're adjusting structures and institutions and changing laws, that people are still hungry, and that people still need to be fed, and people still need help, and they need testing. And so I think that's one of the things that we could focus on doing as a church. Some of us may be thermometers. Some of us may be thermostats. Some of us may do both. But I think that's a very practical way of thinking about how we can engage and give theology a public face in the public square, so that we're not just hearing the word, but we're also doing what the word says.
Come on. This is good. 2 minutes left. Jump in here.
Real quick. Number one, America can't heal from what she ain't real about. This is the time of being real about the ugly underside of America. America has to listen, and prophetic preaching rises up to expose the ugly underbelly of the hypocrisy of America's practice of democracy. And that leads us to number two, change cost. I'm not impressed with the symbolism right now. Real structural change. That's what prophetic witness is about. It costs something. Martin King said it ain't cost nothing to bring down just a segregation signs, but it's gonna cost something to bring about liberation and justice for all. Change costs, and you can't heal from what you ain't real about.
I think that the other piece is that it's really a time for the church to re-examine and reevaluate and look at itself. It must become, again, a therapeutic center where we're asking the question, much like Jesus, would you be made whole? Fact of the matter is, a lot of folk are sick. This is a sick society. And how do we begin to minister to people who are sick? First of all, they got to acknowledge that something's wrong with them. And we know something is wrong. All the evidence suggests that something is wrong. So they got to look at Black preachers, and particularly the Black church, as being the only institution that is out here preaching a real relevant gospel that has a word for a message in this message. So the fact of the matter is, how do we begin to deal with speaking to the issue at heart to say that this is our time? And you see it with this interesting mosaic and with this tapestry with people from all walks of life, all colors, all genders coming together saying enough is enough. Now we're going to change it so it'll be, like you said, not what it is, but what it ought to be.
That's right. Thank you, Bishop, so much. Dominic, Reverend Dr. Dean, I know you want to say something, but we are out of time. Our founder is here, Reverend Green.
All right, Stephen. All right,
Stevie.
We can't hear you.
We can't hear you, bro.
Oh, okay. I'm muting myself. We gotta keep moving, but tell us your final word.
All I'm gonna say is go see a therapist. 'Tis the season to be made whole and be healed.
Amen. Thank y'all. We appreciate y'all. We thank you all so much, Bishop, Reverend Dr. Gina Stewart, Dr. Freddie Haynes, Dr. Dominique Robinson, the Dean, and Reverend Reginald Sharp. Thank you all so much. What an incredible panel discussion. So thank you all so much. We look forward to continuing. You got to see the comments. They've been going live.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Green. We appreciate
the invite.
Thank you. Absolutely.
All right.
All right. We are, man, what an incredible panel. What an awesome experience this has been so far. After a panel like that, you got to make some noise in the comments. If you were excited about that panel, you learned something that you needed to have today, will you just send us a message in the comments today so that we can continue to be inspired? We're still trekking towards this path towards freedom, but we are just grateful, Reverend Elaine, also to all of those who have been a part of this session so far. We are about to get ready to transition to the next panel. But before we do that, we want to make sure that everyone has all that they need to be able to continue to support the work that's happening right now. You could text the word JusticeCon, GAC, to the number 77977. JusticeCon, GAC, to 7977 to support the ministry of Faith for Black Lives and Great Island Cathedral as we continue to take JusticeCon to the world. I don't know if there's ever been a more dope prophetic preaching panel to happen in cyberspace than the one we just experienced. So we want to thank you all for the time today. So we've got a few minutes to break, stretch your legs, and we will come back here at 3:30 with the panel Healing is Resistance, Spirituality, and Self-Care.